So welcome everyone. My name is David Chinnery. I work for Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County, and you're seeing one of our Lunch in the Garden webinars, which we've been doing for over a year now. So welcome to our program today. And we've covered a lot of different gardening topics, and it's been a whole lot of fun. And we're really grateful for folks coming on and learning about Zoom and tuning in and being part of our programs. Today we have a lot of folks signed up. So far we're up to 58 people, which is great. And I expect more will be rolling in as we continue. If for some reason you'd like to see this program again, and you probably will because there's a lot of really good detailed information today, you want to visit our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and type in the search box of YouTube, Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County. Now it's a long title, and you have to, I don't know if you have to spell Rensselaer right or not, but try to. It's not the easiest word to spell. But if you do that, you can visit the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County channel, and we will have posted today's webinar on the channel. So you can go back and watch it and catch up on some of the details about native plants. So today we have a really great program. I'm very excited to see our program today myself. We're going to be talking about why garden with native plants. And we have two of our master gardeners here, Cathy Welling and Betsy Kauffman. And you're both from the class of 2018, is that right?
Yes.
So these are some of our newest master gardeners, and they've really jumped into this topic and have done a fantastic job today. So I'm going to let them take over and enjoy everyone, and I'll come back at the end and we'll take the questions at the end. That's what I need to say. Type your questions in the chat box, and at the end we'll answer all of your questions. Okay, so I think we're ready to go.
Or at least we'll try to answer all your questions
Yes.
that way. All right, I'm going to share my screen. And
That looks good.
there we go. All right. So, okay, thanks, David. And welcome everybody to our program on the why of gardening with native plants. As David said, both Betsy and I have been master gardeners since 2018, and I have become very interested in gardening with natives. And the Rensselaer County Master Gardeners have a working group on native plants, and this is actually the second program that we've done that we've developed out of the discussions that we've been having. Our first program was on kicking the invasive exotic gardening habit. And if you're interested in seeing that, you can go to the YouTube channel that David mentioned, and that is available. So Betsy, why don't you just give a little introduction for yourself?
Oh, well, we've already introduced ourselves as 2018 class master gardeners. And I think that we started going, we had well, we'll describe this in a minute, but we had a book discussion about a year ago when Doug Tallamy's newest book came out called Nature's Best Hope. And we got so excited about it that that's when our group started, the Native Gardening Group. And we've sort of met about monthly, and we've come up with a few minor projects, these presentations being some of them, and we're enjoying ourselves very much.
Okay, well, let's get started. We'll talk just a little bit about traditional gardens and then compare those to what we're thinking about when we're talking about native gardens. So a traditional garden tends to be very, they tend to be all about us, about what we see. These are the gardens that we often will see kind of in people's yards and in formal gardens like you can see here. They're about what we see, what we smell. It's about us. They tend to be somewhat static in terms of creating this snapshot of what we're looking at. And oftentimes there will be many exotic plants that are not native to the area. A lot of times, particularly, I mean, we think back to some of the gardens from the 1800s, the gardeners were very interested in bringing in plants from Asia, from Europe, from other places. Kind of the more unusual, the better. It was, what about that plant that only blooms on July 31st if there's a full moon? They were looking for kind of exotic things to put in their garden. And oftentimes, because there's not a lot of diversity in these gardens, they might not be particularly friendly to wildlife. So in terms of native plant gardens, there's much more of an emphasis on moving away from this human-focused garden to one that really interacts with the entire environment. It includes not just the plants, but the insects, other pollinators, birds, other wildlife that might be in that particular landscape. And it's really designed to move away from this idea of a static snapshot to something that's dynamic, that changes, that moves and changes with the season. Obviously, you're going to have native plants that are going to dominate. It doesn't mean you can't have some exotic plants in there. They're fine to have in there for kind of a dramatic appeal, or you do want to be careful if you don't want to have those exotic invasive thugs in your garden. But the idea is to kind of make a gradual shift to planting more of the native plants in these gardens. And what we do know about native plants is that they've co-evolved with all the other wildlife. So they have a natural interaction with that wildlife. As Betsy mentioned, Doug Ptolemy he's kind of like, he's the mover and the shaker in the world of native plants. He's a professor at the University of Delaware, and he's an entomologist, and he really is sort of this visionary native plant promoter. His primary research goal is to kind of better understand how insects interact with plants and how those interactions are going to determine the diversity of the entire animal community in those areas. So he's authored lots of papers, lots of articles, a number of books, and as Betsy said, we've read a couple of his books, and really this has really sparked an interest for us. So his work, along with some other of the kind of native plant promoters, are really what inform this presentation. So we'll start again with making sure that we're all kind of on the same page. Before I want to do that, I want to just mention where we're going to go with this particular program. We're going to start with definitions, and then we're going to talk about, Betsy's going to talk about the plant's purpose, its function, in terms of its ecosystem services, how it relates with energy in the food web, talk some about plant propagation and how that relates to biodiversity in gardens. And then we're going to shift a little bit from the kind of the why to the how, and talk a little bit about how to get started, or how to increase what you might already have been doing in terms of looking at your property, evaluating what you have, and making some choices. And then we're going to mention some ways that you can join with other folks that are also involved in this, in promoting native plant gardening. So here's some definitions, so to make sure we're kind of all on the same page in terms of what we mean by a native plant. Here are a couple pictures of two native plants. That on the right you have a sneezeweed, which is a helenium, and on the left is a clematis virginiana, which is a native clematis, native to our area. Native plants are ones that have evolved over hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, and they were here before European settlers came to the area. And they do well. They've evolved over here, so they're going to do well with the soil, with the water level that we have, with the weather, the climate, etc. And as they've evolved in the area, they've also co-evolved, as we mentioned before, with the natural wildlife that's here. And they tend to contribute the most ecosystem services, and we'll be talking more about exactly what that means. But the important thing to understand is native isn't native everywhere. You have to have what we call a geographic qualifier, whether we're talking about New England states or New York State or Rensselaer County, or we'll also be talking about ecoregions. So we'll kind of share how you would identify it. It's easy to figure out what state you live in, what county you live in, but how do you know what ecoregion you live in? We'll talk a little bit more about that. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about native plants. So non-native plants are those that have been introduced. Sometimes they're referred to as exotic or alien introduced plants, but they have not evolved naturally within this particular environment. They come from somewhere else. And I mean, that could be somewhere else could mean just a different part of the country, or it could mean, another continent. They often will do pretty well in the local environment. But one of the problems is that they can compete with some of the native plants for the resources that are available. And they are less able to contribute to the food web and to the kind of the energy structure. Although they do contribute some ecosystem services, but it's at a lower level than our native plants. And one of the problems is that they can actually be invasive plants. They can become invasive. And then we talk about the invasive plants. And again, they're by nature, they're not native, although we can have invasive native plants as well. We do have to pay attention to those. But we're talking about those plants that have been introduced to this region from someplace else. And again, you can see a couple examples over here. We have yellow flag iris and also oriental bittersweet, two real common invasive plants in our area. Although they're not native, they do really well in our environment. And they can do so well that they can actually outcompete the native plants for the resources, and they can actually crowd them out. And they really have much less ability to contribute ecosystem services. And the bottom line is that they tend to have an overall negative impact on our environment. So our goal is to really focus on those native plants and take a look at how we can incorporate more of those into our gardens. Doug Ptolemy talks about his goal is that gardens should have 70% native plants and 30% non-native plants. Obviously, you don't really want to focus on the invasives, but you can have non-natives in a successful garden. So Betsy's going to talk about ecosystems. So take it away, Betsy.
All right. This is a rather general term, but I thought I would define it anyway. It's a living and non-living factors put together within an ecological community, and so they're considered all together. There are actually four components. One is the living things, which are the biotic components, the physical environment, which is the abiotic, and the energy and nutrients that cycle through this system. The important point I want to make is that ecosystems can vary in size. They can range from a large unbroken forest tract to a small ephemeral pond somewhere that doesn't even take up much area, but it's its own little ecosystem. But most importantly, an ecosystem can be our backyard as well, and that's what we want to focus on. Consider our backyard and our front yard as being its own ecosystem. Okay, so we often read about ecosystem services and what plants can do for us and the services that they provide. This term has been used more and more frequently, and it was not necessarily coined, but first came into use when a Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report in 2005 was published. This report pulled together thousands of scientists around the world who assessed the state of the Earth's ecosystem service. And really, they had a one-time report. There's another group of people called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, who have since then published periodic reports. Their reports differ a little bit from the Millennium Ecosystem Report in that they're not so much human focused, whereas the Millennium Report was quite human focused because it was looking at the services that benefit us. But the reason I pulled this out is because this is the origin of these four categories of ecosystem services that I think we should be aware of, because I want you to think of plants in terms of the services they provide. We've now degraded more than 60% of the Earth's ecosystem, and the world has entered its sixth mass extinction event, which is different from the previous events in that it's human caused. So the hope is that maybe because it's human caused, we can do something about preventing it from going any further. Okay, next. The next slide is going to show the services as laid out by the Millennium Assessment. There are 4 categories: the provisioning, and the provisioning relates to the products that are provided by the ecosystem. The cultural benefits are the non-material benefits, and the ones that we generally consider when we are gardening, or in the past. In the future, we may be more looking toward the supporting services, which are actually necessary for the production of all the other services, and the regulating services, which are the services that we hope that by better gardening, we can regulate to benefit us the most. Okay, next one. In the United States, Doug Tallamy divides up the land use in this way into 5% of which are pristine, and this would include the large forest tracts and the national parks and so forth. 41% agriculture, and 54% of the rest makes up the cities, suburbs, malls, golf courses, and other development land, with a few habitat fragments. And it's these habitat fragments that we'd like to focus on because we want to increase the ecosystem services in those fragments so that they can really make our life much better, and our whole community and the whole ecosystem. Doug Tallamy also emphasizes the loss of abundant species in the United States. The bird numbers across North America have fallen by 2.9 billion since 1970. That's a lot of bird numbers. And his focus really in encouraging native gardening is to focus on the birds. And when they come back, we've got our system in a good state. Insect populations are also decreasing dramatically. Now, in the next slide, I'm going to just talk about what plants supply us with. They supply the food chain. They're the source of essentially all of the energy that powers an animal. If you think about it, everything that you eat comes comes originally from a plant. And plants are the primary producers of the food chain. They make up the first trophic or nutritional level. They're called the autotrophs because they make their own food. And they directly or indirectly feed all the consumers. So next slide will show you how this happens. It's through photosynthesis. So the plants take carbon dioxide and water, and the energy from the sun, or photons, or light energy from the sun, and then in more than one equation, it's really a complicated process, but essentially this is what happens. And the end products are sugar or carbohydrates and oxygen. The oxygen's important, the carbon dioxide, all of it is very, very important. And the captured energy is then passed up the food chain to support terrestrial animals. And the next slide is going to show you a schematic of the trophic levels. And the difference between a food chain is just one line through that process. I don't think I can point. You can't see my pointer, can you?
Oops, sorry.
Okay. But I wanted to point out the insects are the really important part of this food chain. And this would be sort of a food web, but I'll show you a little bit more of a food web later. The food web describes the whole flow of energy through the whole ecosystem, and it's a lot more complicated than just a food chain. So the food chain is sort of the basic idea, but the food web is what is reality. So we're looking at the primary producers and then the consumers as we go up the food chain. And with each step, the energy derived from the sun is passed on to make them live. So the next slide will tell you why insects are so important. E.O. Wilson was an important biologist and a naturalist. He's sometimes been called the new Darwin or the father of biodiversity. And his quotes are seen all over the place. But one of the most important ones is insects are the little things that run the world. And he believes that humans would last only a few months if insects were to disappear from the earth. That's how important they are. So why are they important? They comprise much of the animal biomass. That is the whole weight of the animal, linking the primary producers and consumers. And the reason for this is because insects eat plants, or one reason. Insects also are very important pollinators. They pollinate 87.5% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. They also provide biological control of weeds, pests, and disease vectors. Now, I know it can be a negative too, because they can become the weeds and pests and disease vectors, but they also can control them. And this is the importance of biodiversity and insect diversity and a plant diversity, so that we can have enough to do this kind of control of the weeds, pests, and disease vectors. And they also play a big role in cycling nutrients. And the next slide, I want to talk about plant-insect interactions a little bit. So an insect herbivore, an insect that eats a plant, is actually an antagonist to the plant, because plants don't want to be eaten. And so through evolutionary time, plant defenses have been developed against herbivores. And one way of doing this is to develop secondary metabolites that deter feeding. And the classic example is monarch butterflies and milkweeds, as we all know. The monarch butterflies can only lay their eggs on milkweed, and milkweed has produced over evolutionary time some chemicals such as toxic cardiac glycosides, which protect their tissues. But on the other hand, the monarch butterflies in particular have developed defenses against that, so that they're able to eat the milkweed leaves, and so that their larvae are able to eat them when they hatch and become caterpillars that feed the birds. That's the bottom line there. So this is the classic example, but there are many, many more. On the other hand, insects that pollinate are actually mutualists for the plants. And because they offer a service to the plant in that they carry pollen from the anther to the ovary of the plant. And so plants have, because they want these insect pollinators other than the herbivores, as opposed to the herbivores, they've changed through evolutionary time to many traits so that they attract the pollinators and a diversity of them. They've changed when they flower, the time they flower, how long they flower, sizes, shapes, and examples, and sizes, shapes, and colors of their flowers. They've also changed their pollen morphology or shape and the nutrition of their pollen. So there's and there are many, many more features that animals that plants have developed in order to attract pollinators. And both of these examples are examples of coevolution. This is what has happened with native plants over thousands of years, so that this mutualistic or antagonistic relationship is going to continue. Importantly, any disruption between pollinator and plant interactions, such as the extinction of a species, or maybe the collapse, or at least lowering the level of a species, can lead to collapse, really entire collapse of an ecosystem. And the collapse also is possible of an agricultural industry. And we've seen some effects on agriculture by the decrease in pollinators. And this is one of the focuses that many agriculturalists are focusing on, is how to get the pollinators back in their fields so that they can increase their crop volume. Okay, next. So this is another important player in the food web. These are the decomposers. And without them, we would have all the waste in the world just piling up and never be able to recycle it again. So these decomposers enable recycling, and they're important to consider. They make the vital nutrients available to the ecosystem's primary producer. They do this by converting complex organic materials into more elementary substances. And the major players in this is the microscopic organisms such as protozoa and bacteria, and the invertebrate organisms, earthworms, termites, and millipedes, for example. And another very important player is the fungi, who get their nutrients from dead materials, and they actually eat into wood and more solid substances and pass them on to the root systems. We studied that in trees. So the decomposers make up a vital component of this. So in the next slide puts this all together in a nice large schematic where you can see the plants in the upper left-hand corner, their soil nutrients, and the usual food web that you see for terrestrial animals, but then the decomposers come in and it makes it a whole cycle. And so that's the full picture. Now, I want to talk a bit about biodiversity, which again is a topic like ecosystem that we're all familiar with and probably don't need to have any explanation, but I'll just go over it anyway. Biodiversity includes all the organisms, species, and populations in the world, and together with their variation and within their complex communities and ecosystems. So we can speak of biodiversity on 3 different levels. The genetic biodiversity, which is the distribution of the gene pool throughout a particular species. The species level, where you have many, many different species, and this is what we want. We want genetic diversity, we want species diversity, and we want diversity within our ecosystems as well. And what does that do for us? What are some of the important things about biodiversity? And this is only just a few to point out. So with a high level of biodiversity, you're able to resist invasion by non-native species. With a low diversity, the non-natives have a chance to get in because they don't have enough people fighting them. It's just like a war. And biodiversity loss can induce climate change by changes in land use and land cover. And so the higher the biodiversity, the better chance we will have to fight against the changes caused by climate. And biodiversity loss also affects how much the plants can sequester carbon. And this can have an important effect, as we know, we talk about that all the time, but biodiversity helps. Biodiversity also helps fight against pests and disease and pollution. Now, I'd like to talk about biodiversity in terms of plant propagation, because this is really important to our ecosystems. There are actually 2 major types of plant propagation. One is sexual by seeds, and the other is asexual or vegetative propagation. So reproduction of plants by seeds, you take the genetic material from 2 parents, the pollen and the ovary of the plant, and they are combined and mixed up, and I'll show you that in a second, to create offspring that are different from each parent. With vegetative propagation, you're just using vegetative part of a plant, stems, roots, or leaves, and due to their meristematic tissue, they are able to divide and differentiate to generate a new plant, and that's a wonderful thing. But there's some drawbacks to asexual propagation, and that is that they don't promote any genetic diversity. The offspring by vegetative propagation is exactly the same, unless there's something disrupted it. They're most likely exactly the same as the parent plant. So you're not generating biodiversity, you're just bringing the same plant on to the next generation without adding anything to it. Vegetative propagation can occur through cuttings, by layering, by dividing, grafting, budding, and tissue culture is a very popular way for vegetative propagation to occur. Vegetative propagation is important in the development of all the new plant varieties that are generated by the research places, the horticultural industry. And it is important. I'm not saying that it's negative, and this is the way you're going to develop cultivars in most cases. But just understand that this is what's happening. This is an asexual process. This is a little schematic about how you can compare vegetative versus seed. On the left of this picture, you can see 2 parents. For sexual reproduction, you'll take hopefully, you'll take the pollen from one parent and and move it over to the second parent, to the female part of the plant. And in the process of various divisions, a seed develops. Now, looking at parent one, you can see that the genes consist of a combination of that is rather distinctive compared to the genome of the second parent. When these cross, when they come together, there's a reshuffling of the genes, and the genome that results in the seed is different from each parent. And this is what we call biodiversity. And this seed then will germinate and grow into a seedling that has a genome that isn't like the parents. It may look similar, it may not, but at least it's different. This is the sexual reproduction, and the result of it is the biodiversity that we're looking for. In vegetative propagation, the gene makeup of the parent is just like the offspring. And in that case, you can actually grow clones. If you make too many of them, they just become clones. As they divide without sexual reproduction, they are all alike each other. These are not biodiverse, and they can sometimes be grown as monocultures, and this is not a good thing. If you look at the next slide, these are some of the problems with monoculture. They displace naturally occurring species, and they upset the ecosystem. You're looking for biodiversity. It can create overcultivated strains of plants, which are less resistant to diseases and the environmental changes that can occur, particularly with climate change. They encourage disease, weeds, and destructive insects, and increase soil erosion because they are not a biodiverse ecosystem that has the ability to, and the variability to compete out these things. So all in all, they are not considered, they certainly can't be considered biodiverse.
So this is probably an example of our largest monoculture, the most common monoculture that we have, certainly in our country. It's our lawns. And there are estimates that over 40 million acres of lawn exists in the United States. And this 40 million acres is equal to an area that's 3 times larger than any other agricultural irrigated crop. So it really is a huge monoculture. And we're not just talking about home lawns. Home lawns are about 20 million acres. We're also talking about all these other, residential or kind of the town park, golf courses, playing fields, etc. But this is our kind of our largest monoculture that we see. So here we have our incredible shrinking lawn. We're talking about why is it important then to shrink the lawn? Why do we need to eliminate this particular monoculture? In one important piece is that most of the species of grass that's used in turf it's not native. And as a result, we've got this monoculture. It's not going to be particularly supportive to birds, to insects. It doesn't retain the water as well. It may have shallow root systems. So you can see some of the other problems associated with the monoculture. If we think about it, we can kind of reverse that and say, well, what are the benefits then of shrinking our lawn? We're going to use less water. According to the EPA, between 30 and 60% of urban fresh water is used to water lawns every year, and turf, like we have in golf courses, requires 2 to 3 times more water than a sustainable mixed landscape would. We can reduce the air pollution and noise pollution. There is one of the statistics about using lawn mowers is that a 3.5 horsepower lawnmower pollutes in 1 hour as much as a car driving at least 100 miles. So you can think about the reduction in both noise and air pollution. There's less yard waste if we're not mowing our lawns. Average 2,000 square foot lawn produces between 600 and 800 pounds of clippings in a season. So if we're not having to deal with those, we have less maintenance that we have to deal with, and we're not kind of adding that to landfills or wherever it might be taken. So some of us would compost, but 600 to 800 pounds is a lot of waste. We reduce the use of herbicides. We enhance our biodiversity because we have less lawn, we have more of a variety of plants in there. And there is actually some sense that when we have a more diverse, low maintenance, attractive landscape, it can actually increase our home values. So there are some advantages to shrinking our lawns. So Betsy talked a lot about the why of gardening with native plants. Now let's talk about, okay, so we've got all this information. We know it's a good idea. Hopefully we've demonstrated that moving towards a native plant garden is a good idea. So let's give you some ideas about how you can either get started if you're not using native plants, or maybe increase what you're doing with native plants. So let's take a look at a couple different things that we can do to get started. First of all, take a look at your yard. What have you got? Look at the whole landscape. Look at what's going on, not just in your yard, but what maybe is happening over across the street from your neighbors and next door in your neighbor's yard. What are they doing as well? So you want to kind of get a sense of what you're already working with. So in that inventory, you want to see what native plants do I already have and what non-native plants do I have? And also you want to look at, do I have invasive plants? Because those are probably the ones that you want to tackle first. You want to take a look at your lawn and see, are there areas that that I could maybe take and use for a native plant garden. That's one of the things that I'm doing this year is I have a hill in my backyard, and I said I can take a section of this and just completely entirely devote it to native plants. This is kind of a newer area for me to get involved in. So I'm kind of excited about really focusing on one specific area that I can just completely devote to native plants. And then again, we're going to choose native plants, and we're going to talk all about how you can do that. And then you want to limit your use, you want to avoid your pesticides and limit your fertilizers because they can be harmful to that ecosystem. So those are some ways to just start getting started. So in terms of choosing native plants, this is sort of a hierarchy of choices that you would make. From the first choice, which is the one that we're really shooting for, that's the most beneficial for ecosystem services, to the least beneficial. So if we start with our native plant species, again, we know what we've defined those. It's the one that's evolved in that natural environment, and we'll refer to them often as a straight native. That's kind of our goal, is to go for the straight natives, because they do contribute the most ecosystem services. The second choice is to plant what we refer to as near native plants. And these are plants that are maybe native not specifically to your exact area, but they might be in a kind of native to a broader area around you. And I'll give you an example. I've developed this obsession with this plant called the groundnut. It's Apios americana, and it's native in New York State, but it has not been found in Rensselaer County. But I'm thinking, well, it's in some of the counties around us, so I'm going to give that a try. I'm going to see if I can get a hold of that plant. That would be considered a near native plant species. Maybe you'll be looking at something that's native to Western Massachusetts, perhaps. Not necessarily native in our area, but could still contribute some ecosystem services. The third choice would be what we refer to as a native cultivar or a nativar. And the way you can identify those is if you are looking at a native plant that's listed and it has a variety listed in quotes, you're looking at a cultivar or a nativar. So for example, yarrow is a native plant, Achillium millefolium, that's a native plant. But oftentimes you'll find a variety of that, for instance, Achillium millefolium terracotta in quotes. That would be a cultivar. Still contributes some, but not really as much. And again, these have been cultivated for particular characteristics, whether it's bloom time or color or disease resistance or something along those lines. So that's our third choice. And then our last choice would be to use those non-native plant species, because again, we know that they contribute the least to the ecosystem. So we start with our native plants, our near natives, our cultivars, and lastly, our non-natives. And again, it doesn't mean you can't have non-natives in your garden, but you want to focus primarily towards your native plants. So Betsy's going to talk just a little bit about this concept of ecoregions.
Well, once you've decided to plant native plants and realize that your choice of native plants has to be characterized by its location, ecoregions are a good way to pinpoint the location of where your plant lives and has existed for a long time. The Environmental Protection Agency and other agencies working with it have come up with a map of ecoregions. And these ecoregions are areas where the ecosystems, that is everything that makes up the ecosystems, are generally similar. And these characteristics of each ecoregion is based on the combination of geology, landforms, soils, vegetation, climate, land use, wildlife, and hydrology, and also human habitation for that matter. So originally, or really overall, there are different levels of ecoregions. Level 1, which is the broadest category, makes up 12 ecoregions in the United States, continental United States. Level 2, they've divided the land into 25 ecoregions. Level 3 has more, 105, and level 4, 967. Now, just for an example, I was figuring out the demo where our Master Gardener's demo garden is in Wine and Skill, New York at the Parker School. And its level 1 ecoregion is Northern Forests. Its level 2 is Atlantic Highlands. Its level 3 is called the Northeast Highlands. And its level 4 is the Taconic Foothills. So we can pinpoint where our land is, and from there we can make our plant choices in terms of what is native to and what is not. And Cathy's going to describe to you how you can look that up. So I just wanted to say that for traditional gardening, we've been taught to make our plant choices dependent on the USDA hardiness zones. Those are not actually as good choices because they're based only on climate, not all these other features. So I would suggest that you if you want to look up your ecoregion, I just want you to know that it exists. Now, the next word I want to introduce is the ecotype. Ecotype is a plant variant with characteristics that are too subtle or too few to be called a variant such as a subspecies. Instead, it's just a variant that has been changed slightly because of the environment it lives in. And we use this term to refer to seeds and plants derived from a specific ecoregion, and because it's been adapted to that specific environment, for instance, the EPA level 3 ecoregion. So the advice I would have if you are going to be considering ecoregions is to look for local ecotype seeds and plants because they come from a source that have similar environmental conditions. You might see this term sometimes, and this is what it's telling you. So I've even heard of native plant sales that are using ecotype plants. So this is what they mean by that. It matches the ecoregion.
All right, so you're ready to put some native plants into your garden. How do you choose? There's a lot of plant choices out there. So there are some kind of a framework that you can think of in terms of what you're looking for. First, you want to think about this concept of nativity. Is this plant that I'm thinking about putting into my garden, is it native to my state, to my county, to my ecoregion? That's the first piece, is we're going to look at nativity. And I'm going to talk about how you can identify that in just a moment. You also might be thinking about, maybe you're specifically looking to plant natives that provide the most pollen or maybe the most nectar because you're trying to attract pollinators to your garden. Or you're thinking about, I really want to support moth and butterflies. So I want to think about what are the host plants for the larvae for those that I could plant in my garden. So you want to choose the right plant for the right spot. And as Betsy said, we're moving away from just hardiness and to thinking about ecoregions. And I just put down at the bottom, and actually I'm going to send David a handout that he can share, he can send out to you folks after the presentation that gives you some more information. Kind of sometimes in a PowerPoint, we go through things a little quickly and you're like trying to scramble and write things down. We'll have some of these on the handout so that you will have that information available to you. You can go to the EPA website to find an ecoregion, but I found another website that I thought was pretty user-friendly, and it's called bplant.org, and I've listed it at the bottom of the PowerPoint slide here. And if you type in ecoregion locator, go back. If you type that in, it will ask you for your town, and you type in the name of your town and state, and you click on the map, and it tells you what your ecoregion is. Just as we saw the demo garden, it takes you all the way down to the Taconic foothills. And out in Averill Park, where I live, which is not too far from Wineskill, I'm also in that particular ecoregion. So you can see that. Okay, so then you say, all right, I know what ecosystem I live in. Well, how do I know what plants are native to that ecoregion? So I included at the bottom this National Wildlife Federation website. If you go to their website and you search in the search box for host plants by ecoregion, they will actually, they'll provide you with information about what plants are native to your particular ecoregion. Also, if you register on this website and you put in your zip code, they'll give you a list of plants that are native to your zip code. The only challenge is once you put that zip code in, it's really hard to find any other zip codes in there once you've sort of registered it. But it's got, great choices of plants. So I'm going to give you another option, and you will actually get this chart will be in the handout. So, because this is a lot of information here, but these are some really great resources for researching the plants that you want to put in your garden. My personal favorite is the New York Flora Atlas, the very first one that's listed. It provides you, I'm going to show you a screenshot of what that website looks like, but it provides you information about the distribution of plants, whether it's native in your county, in your state. USDA does the same thing, although that's broadened out to include the whole United States and Canada. The Biota of North America program, or BONAP, that gives you all of North America. Go Botany focuses more on New England, the New England states. At the Lady Bird Johnson Wildlife Center, or Wildflower Center, it gives you lots and lots of very specific plant information, but it links back to the USDA for location. And then if you're looking specifically for planting plants that are native plants that are going to attract birds, the Audubon Native Plants Database has really good information on that. And also, if you're looking for attracting butterflies and moths, the National Wildlife Federation, their Native Plant Finder, is a great resource. And this, again, you will get this information in the handout. So let's take a look at what you would get if you were to go to the New York Flora Atlas. And what I did is I chose when I talked about the native plants, I identified the Clematis virginiana as a native clematis plant. So what I did is up at the top, you can see there's a search box up here, if you can follow my pointer. And you can search by, in this website, you can search by scientific name, by common name, by county, by genus, by family. So you can search on a plant up there to find out whether or not it's actually a native in your area. And you can browse by the county to see what plants have been identified. So this map over on the right is actually showing you where the plant has been identified in New York State. So over here, it will tell you the status. And here it tells you, oh, yes, that's native. And then there's a whole bunch of other terms, and you can kind of play with that a little bit on here. There's just boundless amounts of information on here. But this tells you whether or not it is a native plant. Sometimes it'll tell you that it's non-native, a plant is non-native, but it's been naturalized or not naturalized. There's lots of information that you can get from this particular website. This is it all. If you're specifically looking for plants, this is a great place to get that information. This is from the USDA site. So you see, again, I put in the Clematis virginiana, and you can find out, again, you can search over here on scientific name, common name, or symbol. And I'm not sure how, I wouldn't know what the symbol was for any plant, so I probably wouldn't be searching by symbol, but a common name or a scientific name. And again, it will tell you where is this plant native, and this shows you in this green that the clematis is native in this whole eastern part of the United States. So that's another source in the plant database. And then the Biota of North America program, again, also gives you information. You can, this will tell you the nativity. It will tell you the yellow here means that it's actually, it's present, but it's rare. Brown means that it's not present at all. So those are 3 examples of places that you can go to search for plants. And I'm going to be also providing a few more for you as well. So we're going to take a switch now, and Betsy's going to talk a little bit about some of the research that's looking at ecosystem services that plants provide.
Okay, so once you know what plants you want to plant, one of the problems you're going to run into when you're looking for a straight species is that they're hard to find. And so you're going to wonder, well, if I could get a cultivar that's derived from a straight species, maybe that will work as well. But many times we don't know that. But there's some research that's been going on. And if you can find this information, it will help you decide what plant you really want and whether you can give up looking for the natives and just sort of settle on the cultivars or not. Annie White is a researcher who lectures at the University of Vermont and is actually owns a business in horticultural landscaping and restorations. So for her doctoral thesis, she submitted this study called From Nursery to Nature, How to Evaluating Native Herbaceous Flowering Plants versus Native Cultivars. And what she's looking at for their ecosystem service is pollinator activity. And so she took 11 groups of plants, the straight native and 1 cultivar of it, and compared them. She's planted them at 2 different sites, fairly hundreds of miles apart, really, in Vermont. And she grew all of them in gardens near each other. And the way she evaluated them was to go out to the plants and actually look whether they had pollinators or not during their bloom time and count the number of pollinators and compare them. So that was quite a job. It took her 2 or 3 years. And I will explain some of them. I'm not going to go over all of them, but for instance, in the far right upper corner is the swamp milkweed, Asclepias tuberosa, the straight native on the left, and the cultivar called Hello Yellow. Right below it is Monarda fistulosa and its cultivar Claire Grace. And then I will go take you the very last one on the bottom, which is that Veronicum virginicum and its cultivar called Lavendel term. So next slide will show you her results. And don't be scared by all these numbers. All you have to do is look at the colors. Look at the green, look at the pink, and look at the blue. And the way this is laid out is you can see, for instance, if you look at this overall, especially on the left, you can see that she actually did not only count for pollinators, but she identified them in terms of whether they belong to these categories of pollinators, which we should be considering. The honeybees, the bumblebees, the other native bees. Honeybees, of course, are not native. Bumble and other native bees are. Flies, butterflies and moths, beetles and bugs, and wasps and ants. Now, she didn't see any wasps or ants during this project. She didn't see a lot of butterflies either, and that actually is quite common. What the biggest number of pollinators are going to be the bees. And so if you look over on the column on the left, then you'll see her comparisons. In the upper half, she calls these selections. These are actually selections from a straight native that haven't been crossbred, whereas the hybrids are selections from the native that have been further crossbred to create their cultivar. And so you can see that in the upper section, comparing the straight native to the simple cultivar, that there was really not any significant difference between the native and the cultivar, except for Veronicastrum, where there was a slight increase for the cultivar over the native, which is the first time I've seen that. But within the hybrid section, there was a preference for the species. So the hybrids, of course, usually are certainly much more distinct genetically than the original straight species. So it's actually not too surprising. But on the other hand, you can see from that, and you'll see it with this next trial too, that actually the cultivars, you're just looking at the number of pollinators, and if it actually occurs in your garden as it did in this trial, that the cultivars might be okay to use. So it's good to know. This information is very useful. In the next study, this was a study that was done in Mount Cuba, which is a very large, I don't know how you describe it. It's a very large study site and a garden center, and not a garden center. It's a marvelous planting site. And there's a lot of trials and information going on there. They have performed trials of other species. They've done trials previously. These were extensive trials of Helenium, Phlox, Monarda, Baptisia, Coreopsis, Euchera, and Asters. In this recent trial, they evaluated 75 plant species of Echinacea and their related cultivars. And they were looking for horticultural traits as well as ecological value. And I think this is one of the first trials they've done that was actually looking for ecological value. And this, I think, is a great thing that they have done. So of these 70, so what they did, well, they evaluated they planted these in huge plots and they looked at them for a period of 3 years, and they looked at size and shape of the plant and how they flowered, how long they flowered, the colors of the flowers, and also disease resistance. So these are all combined together under their horticultural traits, and they gave them a number. They evaluated them and gave them a number. And if you read the trial report, which is very easily obtained online, you can see descriptions of all of these natives and their cultivars, and see a little bit more information than what I'm going to present here. But the thing that I thought was interesting was that they also counted pollinators. And how they did this was over a period of 2 years, they went out every day during the time the plants were blooming, and they looked at one flower of each accession, and they counted the number of pollinators on it for 1 minute. And so it doesn't seem like a lot, but you would have to look through this for 75 plants every day for a minute on each, within each of the plant groups. And so they counted the pollinators, and then they got all the numbers together, and they pooled them, and they decided that they would present them as number of pollinator visits per year. So they're presenting to you a value per year. And in this chart, we see we see them lined up in terms of the pollinators. So the one at the top had the most pollinator visits per year. And this turned out to be a cultivar called Fragrant Angel, and there's a picture of it on the left. Also, the nice thing I like about this chart is it also puts it in the colors that the petals were. So the flower color is there too. The second one that had the most pollinators was the straight species, Echinacea purpurea. Then also what you can see in this chart is the little symbols that look like a leaf next to some of the plants. And those are the ones that were horticulturally superior based on their numbering system. So you can see the whole trial really in this slide. But in the next slide, you can get a real overview. This is listing all of the species. I hadn't counted those, but I assume it's close to the 75. And what I wanted to point out to you here is that they're all lined up according to their pollinator numbers. So it goes from the highest to the lowest. But the green bars are the single flowered species, be they straight or cultivar. And the red bars are the double flowered. So you can see the red bars all cluster at the low end. So obviously in their trial, as we might have expected, they have less number of pollinators, considerably less. Also, you can see in this particular chart is that the top performing cultivars from a horticultural perspective are marked by this leaf symbol, and you can see they sort of all cluster in the end of the high pollinators. So that means that it seems as if the cultivars that have good horticultural value also tend to be pollinators. So the question is then, I decided that I want to plant Echinacea. Which one should I choose? Well, obviously your first choice is going to be a straight native, but if you can't find one, there are multiple cultivars that are available, but you might want to pick the ones from the left side of the graph rather than ones at the other side. So this is the kind of information that it's really good for you to know. And sometimes you don't know where to go for it. And this is one site, Mount Cuba, and hopefully they'll be doing more in terms of ecological value instead of the other. Okay, this last study was done in the UK. And in this case, they took seeds, they took commercially available seeds, one packet, or rather one kind, the annual packet comes from one packet and the perennials from another. And they grew them in meadow type sites within cities in the UK. There were actually 80 different sites in 4 different cities. And so that was a lot of flowers to look at over a period of several years. And what they did in this trial was they didn't look at pollination as in the last study, but they actually picked flowers and measured the pollen in terms of floral units. So they measured the pollen volume. They also in this study measured nectar. I'm just showing you the pollen results right now. But these are the kind of studies that if you find them and you're wondering, oh, what should I choose? It's nice to know, well, gee, within the annual group, that little green symbol, the upper right-hand corner, is the amount of pollen that's produced by the field poppy that's so common in Europe. Remember, this is in Europe. The second most common was the California poppy, and the third most common was the pot marigold. Now, most of these plants are not American natives, except for the California poppy. But it's interesting to see that these kinds of studies are done, and they are actually searchable, so you can find these out if you look hard. It's not easy. A couple of things that I wanted to say about this study is that the perennials actually produced more nectar, significantly more nectar and pollen than the annuals did. That the weeds produced the most nectar and pollen in the early part of the season where they seem to predominate. So you can get interesting information from this type of study. Okay, now before we end up finally making our final choice for plants, we should have an understanding of pollinators and host plants. And these are often put into categories as either generalists or specialists. So if we're talking about host plants, we're talking about plants that insects eat, they're herbivores, insects as herbivores. And 90% of insect herbivores are diet specialists that are restricted to eating just one or a few plant lineages. And whether they are specialists or generalists is important in this case, because we know that if we want to produce a larger number of caterpillar larvae to feed the birds in our yard and attract them to our yard, then we need to have the plants that the moths and caterpillars, moths and butterflies will eat. And if we know that they're diet specialists, then we have to find out what plants, and Cathy's going to talk about that in a minute. We want to plant the plants that the butterflies and caterpillars will lay their eggs on to produce the caterpillars for birds to eat or to raise their young. I'm getting caterpillars and butterflies mixed up, I'm sorry. So the bottom line is, since these herbivores are specialists, we're going to have to provide the plants that attract them. And we know from a few really important studies, something that will help us decide to do this. One was a study that was actually done in 1961, where they counted the caterpillars that a chickadee, in this case, they were looking at chickadees, would eat. And they found that it takes between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to raise a nest of chickadees. That's a lot of caterpillars. And so if you consider that that's only feeding them until they fledge, after that, the parents usually feed them a little bit longer too. So those numbers are extremely high. Why are caterpillars important? Because they provide a very large biomass. And just to give you an idea of the importance of these caterpillar bird interaction, I just want to mention a study by Desiree Narango, who was a student of Doug Ptolemy at the time. And she studied two kinds of suburban landscapes. She was comparing them with one another. One landscape had primarily native plants in it. The other had at least 75% non-native plants. And she found that in the non-native plant study, there was 75% less caterpillar biomass, which resulted in less chickadees being developed. So this is a study to keep in mind if you're interested in birds and you want to present good ecological services that will increase your bird population. This is something to keep in mind. Interesting, very good study. There's also, if you'll go back a minute,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. You can also talk about pollinators as generalists and specialists. And as I mentioned before, most of our pollinators are bees, and they are 70% of them are plant generalists, but 30% or 25 or 30% are plant specialists. And so we need to be aware of what plants we're planting for pollinators, and these are mostly herbaceous flowering plants, that we need to have a sufficient quantity and diversity for both the specialists and the generalists. Some people say to plant for specialists, and that is important because otherwise we're going to lose the specialists. But we need to plant for generalists too, because if we have too many specialist plants, the generalists are going to go for them. If we don't have plants for the generalists as well as for the specialists, we need to have a good combination of both, so the generalists don't overwhelm the specialist flowers. And there has been a study where they showed that the pollination population actually dropped significantly when they removed some of the generalist plants. So I think we need to consider both. Okay.
Okay. So I think the important thing to understand is that even within the kind of the broader set, the larger set of native plants, some native plants have more value, and we call these plants keystone plants. And this term was actually coined by a zoologist and ecologist from University of Washington. His name's Robert Payne, and he says that these keystone plants actually they contribute a disproportionately large effect on the abundance and the diversity of the other species in the ecosystem. They support other species in the ecosystem and they help them coexist. And without these keystone plants, according to Payne, the food web all but falls apart. So it's really important to have these keystone plants. And from what you can see, some of this data on here is from Doug Ptolemy again. In our woody plants, the native oaks, cherries, willows, and birches, and the number next to it in the parentheses is actually the number of species of insects that are attracted to those particular plants. So you can see that those are some, if you're thinking about planting trees and you want to attract pollinators, you want to attract birds, these are some really valuable ones to plant, as well as the goldenrod, sunflowers, and asters are herbaceous plants. Don't attract quite as many, but still attract a high number. And then we can also, as Betsy was talking about specialist pollinators, if we want to make sure that we're planting for them, these are some suggested plants that will attract specialist pollinators. And if you're looking for more information about that, there's a couple places to look for that. Pollinator.org is the Pollinator Partnership. It's a nonprofit that's devoted to protecting and promoting pollinators and their ecosystems. And they have these planting guides that you can search for. And again, you can go to their website and you can put in your zip code and it will take you to one of these eco-regional planting guides that's specific for that region. Personally, I find this site to be a little slow loading, but once you get there and you get this amazing amount of information about plants to plant, it's really worth the wait. It will tell you specifically what plants to plant to attract specific pollinators, and also indicates host plants for the specific butterfly larva. An additional resource is the Pollen Specialist Bees of the Eastern United States. Boy, that has amazingly detailed information. But if you just Google that, you'll get to the website and it provides you lots of information. Both of these will be on the handout that you'll be receiving as well. So those are some resources for specialist pollinators. So there are lots of organizations that are actually involved in supporting gardening with natives. And we wanted to share just a couple. And again, Doug Ptolemy's work really has informed so much of what we do. So we'll start with kind of this organization that's grown out of his work, which is called the Homegrown National Park. And really what their goal is to take the half of all the green lawns in the United States and convert that to native plantings. His movement is, what he's suggesting is if we can do that in our yards, we can actually start to develop what we call homegrown national parks. A quote from him, he basically says that how big is this 20 million acres that he wants to change? It's bigger than the combined areas of the Everglades, Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Teton, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands, Olympic, Sequoia, Grand Canyon, Denali, and the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. So again, we can create homegrown national parks that cover as much area as some of our large national parks. And you can actually become a part of this by putting your contributions onto their website. They have an interactive visual that you can participate in. This will be on the handout as well. And here are 10 steps that they suggest. Shrink your lawn, get rid of your invasive species. Think about those keystone plants. Plant lots of plants, not just a couple. Think about planting for your specialists. Network with other people who are in the area. Maybe get your neighbors involved. Think about the hardscape in your property, and I'll show you a couple examples of that. You want to make sure that you're thinking about how can we support these caterpillars through their entire life stages. Eliminate your spraying and fertilizing, and then work with the town, with the community to see what they're doing and encourage them to continue with this work. So another organization is called the Pollinator Pathways. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to actually kind of connect areas of pollinator specific plants and native plants that are going to attract pollinators from, they're making sort of a corridor, if you will, of native plants so that pollinators can move freely through the environment. And again, it's not like you have to turn your entire lawn into a native plant. You can native plant garden. You can start with flower pots. You can start with curb strips in towns to support these pollinator pathways. So, and this is from their website. You can see the organizations that have become involved with this. And I know that some of the master gardeners in the rest of the state, from Putnam County and I believe Schenectady County, have joined in with the pollinator pathways. You can also let people know what it is you're doing, and there are ways that you can actually publicize your efforts. There's signage that you can buy to say, hey, I'm part of this movement. I'm doing something about it. These are just some examples of those organizations. And again, all of the links to these sites will be in the handout. So you can see there's lots of ways that we can publicize our efforts and maybe even recruit some other folks by letting them know what it is that we're doing. Just a couple things about, we do have to recognize that we share our landscapes with other wildlife, some willingly, some maybe not so willingly. But our native plants have co-evolved with deer. And one of the challenges is when you go out and you buy deer-resistant plants, they're mostly ornamentals. Many of them can be invasive, but they're all either cultivars or hybridized. So they're not our straight natives. We have to get creative a little bit about how we can do this. And Betsy and I are both were sparked by the speaker from the Spring Garden Day this year to get the wireless deer fence, which is a post that has an attractant on the top. And when a deer comes and touches it with their very sensitive nose or their tongue, they get a mild electrical shock, and it's supposed to be very good at keeping them away. So we'll see what happens. Betsy and I are both going to try that this year to see if that makes a difference. We also have other wildlife that we want that are good to have around. Maybe you have those window wells that toads and frogs or other little critters can get caught in. If you can't cover them with a window well cover, maybe you could build, like this little guy here has a little bridge that helps him to get out of the window well so that he can stay safe. So that's one way that you can do that. I don't know if it's a he or she. We want to protect our moths by using motion sensor lights rather than just, lights that are on all night long. This is a challenge for me, is to not mow any lower than 3 inches. I like a closely cropped lawn. So this will be my challenge, is to not mow real close to the ground, but keep it at least 3 inches. And then also we can attract birds with a little bit of moving water. That can be, and that also is helpful to insects as well. So maybe you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed from all this information. We're talking about research, we're talking about many different sites. So what are some simple things you can do? So let's just give you a few ideas of things you can do. So maybe you've got a part of your lawn that you can plant an oak tree in. That's one of our keystone plants. You can look for some annual native annuals. They're not real easy to find, but that's one way to kind of add some of that nativity into your property. Look at your invasive plants. Can you eliminate some of those invasive plants? And if you eliminate them, can you replace it with a native instead? Or maybe you're thinking about adding a new plant to your garden. Think native. Those are some simple things that you can do to kind of get started and maybe not feel quite so overwhelmed by all of this information. I'll just mention a couple. These are some local sources for native plants. These will be on the handout as well. They are ones that have been in the past demonstrated to carry some straight natives. So they're good places to kind of check out. They're all local places as well. And then Betsy's going to kind of take us out with this last slide.
Okay, what we really wanted to get across to you was that this really is a new paradigm in gardening. And we don't want you to rip out your old garden, but maybe move towards something that away from the aesthetic pleasure and appreciate the ecological services your garden can provide. So I hope that if you learn more, or as you learn more, you'll be motivated to start planting native. But don't forget that you alone can make a difference just by planting native where you live. Thank you.